Hi everyone, I'm Douglas Burberry and I'm a scholar of history and Tasmania. Now, pretty much ever since the Ross Bridge was completed in 1836, it has been admired for the beauty of its architecture and for the wonder of the carvings which adorn all of the stones on its arches. The first book which has attempted in a comprehensive way to tell the story of the Ross Bridge and to provide an interpretation of the carvings is titled Ross Bridge and the Sculpture of Daniel Herbert. This book was written by Leslie Greener and Norman Laird and was published in Hobart in 1971. There was only one edition published and it is now out of print, but if you are interested in getting hold of it, every now and then a used copy turns up in second-hand bookshops or in online auctions. The copy shown here is my personal copy, and as you can see, the dust jacket is very worn and tattered. This is a book that has not been sitting inside a book cabinet gathering dust and resale value. I have thumbed its pages and made continuous reference to it for many years. It is very much a book of reference. And to this day, this book remains about the only publication which deals with the topic of the Ross Bridge in a comprehensive way. And as a result, it has come to be regarded as something of the definitive text on the subject, which, as I explain below, is a bit of a pity. There have been many newspaper and magazine articles, pamphlets, online blogs and other discussion threads dealing with some aspect or other of the Ross Bridge history and meaning. But all of these other works end up referring in some way or another to the content of Greener and Laird's book. The problem with this is that Greener and Laird's book is full of inaccuracies and errors, and in many places it contains what can really only be called imaginative fancy. Norman Laird's article on the meaning of the carvings in particular is almost entirely speculative and contains nothing of what could reasonably be called fact. In fact, it's all just tenuous theories, wild assumptions, and what I can only refer to as high-sounding but obtuse academic nonsense. Okay, so I'll open the book up to its contents page. Here we can see that the book is divided into three main sections. The first section is called The Bridge at Ross, written by Leslie Greener. This gives a history of the construction of the bridge. It also gives a bit of a history of the original bridge that stood there. Second section, called Daniel Herbert and His Icons, is written by Norman Laird. This is a fairly lengthy article on the bridge itself, Laird's impressions of the carvings of the bridge. It also details his theory as to why he thinks Daniel Herbert was the architect of the bridge, or not the architect, but the person who masterminded the carvings. It's also, I think, our main source on the interpretation of the carvings, particularly the icons, which form the faces on the bridge. If we just go over to the last page here, we can see the third section, which is this description, commentary and select symbols, also written by Norman Laird. Now, this is the section which I think is complete and utter nonsense. If anyone has ever actually read it from start to finish, I'd be very impressed. I think it's a load of academic, well, nonsense, yes. There is actually an appendix, which is a report of the official opening of the Ross Bridge. It's a transcription of a newspaper article which appeared in October 1836, describing the ceremony when the bridge was officially opened. Greener's article on the story of the bridge's construction, which forms the first part of the book, is more closely based on actual history, but he makes a lot of errors in fact, and he also twists around some of the events he talks about and completely fabricates others. He claims his article to be a work of scholarship and even provides a list of references at the end. But I get the feeling that his main aim was not to faithfully record history at all, but instead to tell a ripping yarn where facts provided a framework but were not of much importance otherwise. If I were to assign numbers to represent how accurate I think Leslie Greener's article is, and please note these numbers themselves are fairly arbitrary, I would say that about 60% of what he writes is correct fact, about 20% is where he gets his facts wrong, and the remaining 20% is just his imagination. But the problem for the casual reader is knowing which is which. And it's also an unfortunate fact that a lot of his wrong information, his errors, and his flights of fancy have come to be regarded as absolute fact. Simply by way of example, here are some of the errors that Greener makes in his article. When he introduces Charles Atkinson, who served for a time as superintendent of the convict gang at Ross, he says that Atkinson sailed on the Hibernia, spelt as shown here. Whereas the name of the ship was actually the Hibernia with an I, not a Y. He also says that the Hibernia left from London, when it actually left from Liverpool. He says that the Royal Staff Corps arrived at Ross in the middle of winter, when in fact they arrived in mid-December, which was summer. He claims that a lot of events at Ross involved a pub known as the Angel Inn, even events which occurred when the Angel Inn wasn't in existence. Also on the topic of pubs, he claimed that the convicts in the public work gang at Ross would regularly meet at John Headlam's public house to discuss their illicit activities. This would have been not just unlikely, but actually quite impossible, considering that Headlam's public house was located around 15 miles away from Ross. And he says that both Daniel Herbert and his wife Mary were buried in the same tomb at Ross, which is wrong. Mary died and was buried in Launceston, not at Ross. I could go on and on with the errors that Greener makes, but I think you get the point. Most of these errors themselves might seem fairly minor, but when they're taken together, they show that Greener was not overly concerned with getting the facts right. As a storyteller, his article may have some value, but as a historian, he really cannot be trusted. And Norman Laird's contribution to the book is arguably worse than Greener's. Whereas Greener is at least entertaining, Laird's contributions are extremely turgid and difficult to read. His articles are absolutely chock-a-block full of obscure academic references and erudite terminology, which gives the overall impression that the author is highly learned in his field and extremely knowledgeable about the subject in hand, but disguise the fact that he really doesn't have a clue what he's talking about. I doubt that many people who have a copy of the book have bothered to read Laird's articles fully. Have you? If you have, let me know in the comments. Let me know if you think the same way. Rather ironically though, it is from Norman Laird that we get most of the theories which have come down to us today regarding the meanings behind the carvings and the identities of the faces which appear on the arches. And of all the contributions that the book by Leslie Greener and Norman Laird has made to the story of Ross Bridge, the biggest one is probably this. It is Greener and Laird who are responsible for claiming that Daniel Herbert was the genius who was principally responsible for the carvings on the bridge. The articles in the book give this award to Daniel Herbert, but the real giveaway to the author's intentions is in the title of the book. Calling it The Sculpture of Daniel Herbert makes it absolutely clear who Greener and Laird thought was responsible for the carvings on the Ross Bridge. Now, I don't agree with this claim, and I have my reasons for it. In a later video, I will explain my reasons why I think Daniel Herbert's role in the Ross Bridge has been exaggerated and who I think might have really been responsible for the carvings. And I will, of course, talk more about other parts of my own research into the bridge. And I will provide sources. So to sum up this video, the book called Ross Bridge and the Sculpture of Daniel Herbert by Leslie Greener and Norman Laird is the principal published reference that we have for the history of the Ross Bridge and the meaning behind its carvings. However, this book should be treated with great care if using it as a historical reference. The chapter written by Leslie Greener is full of inaccuracies and imagination, and the articles written by Norman Laird are really nothing more than nonsensical academic waffle. But to date, they are largely all we have.